The wooden sign snaps back with a crack that echoes like a sudden whip crack through the cabin. It is December 1st, 1955. Outside, the Montgomery air is biting. Inside, the atmosphere is a pressurized vault of unwritten rules. James Blake, a driver with a voice like grinding gravel, stands up, his heavy boots thudding against the floorboards. He stares down the woman in the middle of the bus. "I want those seats," he growls. 3 passengers scramble to their feet, a practiced reflex of survival in a divided world. But Rosa Parks? She doesn't move, she doesn't blink. She simply reclaims her breath while the world outside the window freezes. "Are you going to stand up?" Blake's face is a mask of rising heat, his hand hovering near the lever of the door. "No," she replies. The word is soft, barely a whisper, yet it carries the crushing weight of a landslide. In that heartbeat, the social architecture of the American South begins to fracture. We've been told the fairy tale. A tired seamstress with aching feet just couldn't take it anymore. But the archives tell a story that is far more strategic and infinitely more subversive. This wasn't a moment of physical fatigue. It was a disciplined masterclass in psychological defiance. Behind those spectacles lay a tactical mind that had been preparing for this collision for over a decade. Tonight, we are deconstructing the most successful high-stakes gamble of the 20th century. How did one quiet no trigger a 381-day siege that brought a major American city to its knees? Was she a victim of circumstance, or the lead operative in a revolution that had been planned in the shadows for years? This is not a lecture on the past. This is the anatomy of a power move that changed the world. The red clay of Pine Level, Alabama, has a way of staining everything it touches, and for young Rosa Louise Macaulay, born on February 4th, 1913, the stains of inequality were visible before she could even tie her own shoes. Her story doesn't begin with a quiet prayer, but with the scent of iron and the heavy atmosphere of unwavering vigilance. After her parents separated when she was just 2 years old, Rosa moved with her mother and brother to her grandparents' farm. Her grandfather, Sylvester Edwards, was a man cut from a different cloth, a former enslaved person who refused to let the world break him. He stood as a human fortress, a silent and unyielding guardian of his family's right to exist. She watched him, absorbing the unspoken lesson that dignity wasn't something granted by the state. It was something you held onto with both hands. Her early years were a marathon of resilience marked by a body that often failed her. She battled chronic health challenges that left her bedridden for weeks, and after a difficult recovery in the 5th grade, she even suffered a temporary bout of blindness. But while her body was fragile, her spirit was being steeled in the furnace of the segregated South. Every day the disparity was hammered home by the sound of an engine. Rosa and the other black children walked miles to a tiny, one-room schoolhouse that lacked basic resources, serving students from the 1st through 6th grade. As they trudged through the dirt, a school bus would roar past, carrying white children to a brand-new brick building, often splashing mud onto the children walking on the shoulder. It was a visceral, daily reminder that the world had drawn a line they weren't supposed to cross. Most children lowered their heads, but Rosa felt a jagged sense of injustice take root. She was never one to accept unfair treatment. Even as a small girl, she met every challenge with a quiet, fierce resistance, driven by a conviction that her dignity was non-negotiable. By the age of 11, she moved to Montgomery to attend the Industrial School for Girls, but the path to an education was never a straight line. In 1929, while in the 11th grade, she was forced to drop out to care for her family. She took jobs in a shirt factory, her hands moving with the rhythmic precision that would one day make her a master seamstress. Most young black women in the mid-1930s were pushed out of the system entirely, with 8 out of every 10 never finishing their studies. Yet Rosa was determined to be the exception. With a grinding persistence, she returned and earned her high school diploma in 1933. She had beaten the odds, but the world waiting outside was already reaching a boiling point. In 1932, a 19-year-old Rosa met a man whose quiet intensity matched the fire smouldering in her own heart. Raymond Parks was a barber by trade, but his real work happened in the shadows, far away from the scent of pomade and the rhythmic snip of shears. He was a veteran of the struggle, a man who moved through the world with the wary grace of someone who knew the price of a single wrong word. Raymond was a member of the League of Women Voters and a staunch supporter of the 9 teenagers in the Scottsboro case. Young lives that hung by a thread after a false accusation in 1931. Marrying Raymond was Rosa's induction into a clandestine world of resistance. Their home became a sanctuary for strategy, a place where they whispered about justice while the rest of the world slept. Raymond understood the gravity of their environment. He often tried to shield Rosa from the most hazardous assignments, famously telling her that if the time came to run, he couldn't leave her, and she simply couldn't outpace the volatility that haunted the Alabama night. But Rosa wasn't looking for an exit. She was looking for a way in. With Raymond's unwavering encouragement, she finally secured her high school diploma in 1933. A feat that placed her in the top percentile of her generation's educational elite. Yet the degree didn't buy her a seat at the table. It only made the inequality more visible. In December of 1943, she walked into the Montgomery branch of the NAACP and didn't just join. She took charge, becoming the secretary to the branch president, E. D. Nixon. For the next 14 years, until 1957, Rosa's desk was the nerve center of a silent conflict. She didn't just file papers. She recorded the collective grief of a community. She was tasked with investigating the most harrowing injustices of the era, including the grave acts of violence committed against women in Henry County. Rosa sat on sun-bleached porches, pen in hand, looking into the eyes of survivors and recording the details of a system that failed to protect them. By 1955, the weight of these stories had become a physical burden. The tragic loss of young Emmett Till in Mississippi that August acted as a final, jagged catalyst. Rosa attended the rallies. She heard the urgent calls for justice, and she felt the collective pulse of a people pushed to the absolute edge. Every day she worked as a seamstress at a department store, her fingers moving with the mechanical precision of someone whose mind was elsewhere. She was stitching more than just fabric. She was weaving together a decade of investigative reports and the quiet lessons of her grandfather's unyielding vigilance. When she boarded the bus on December 1st, 1955, she wasn't carrying a shopping bag. She was carrying the accumulated evidence of a century of denied dignity. The open loop of her life, the question of how to fight without retreating, was about to find its answer in the simplest, most stationary act of defiance imaginable. The iron clang of the cell door at the Montgomery police station was the decisive signal for a mobilization no one saw coming. While Rosa Parks was being fingerprinted and released on bail, a network of phone lines across the city began to hum with a frantic, electric energy. It was the night of December 1st, 1955, and the time for investigating was over. The time for making history had arrived. E.D. Nixon, the veteran activist who had bailed her out, didn't just see a victim in Rosa. He saw a catalyst. By the time the sun rose on Friday, the plan was already circulating through the pews and the parlors. A one-day boycott on Monday, December 5th, the day of Rosa's trial. Handbills were printed in the dead of night, tens of thousands of them, whispering a radical idea to a population that had been silenced for generations. Stay off the buses. Walk for your dignity. If we don't ride, the system doesn't run. Monday morning arrived with a silence that was deafening. The city's fleet of yellow and green buses rolled out of the depots, their engines vibrating against the asphalt. But they were ghost ships. Usually packed to the brim with commuters, the buses now carried nothing but the driver and a handful of bewildered passengers. Outside, the world had changed. In the pre-dawn grey, thousands of men and women began to move. They walked in pairs, in groups, and in solitary determination. Some rode in carpools that functioned with the precision of a strategic operation, but most simply walked. They walked through the morning mist and the evening chill, some covering over 20 miles to get to their jobs and back. At the courthouse, 500 people gathered to cheer Rosa as she walked inside with her attorney, Fred Gray. The trial was a formality. She was found guilty and fined $10 plus $4 in court fees. But as she stepped back into the Alabama light, the fine was irrelevant. The real verdict was being delivered on the streets by the thousands of feet striking the pavement in unison. That evening, a newly formed organization called the Montgomery Improvement Association met at the Holt Street Baptist Church. They needed a leader, someone with a voice that could turn a local grievance into a national anthem. They chose a newcomer, a 26-year-old minister named Martin Luther King, Jr. As he spoke to the overflowing crowd, his voice booming with the cadence of an ancient prophet, the one-day boycott transformed into a strategic siege. This wasn't going to be a weekend protest. It was a test of absolute endurance. The city authorities, convinced that the community would fold after the first rainy day, were met with a wall of southern steel. The boycott stretched into weeks, then months. The transit company's finances began to hemorrhage, its buses sitting idle in the lots, costing the city thousands of dollars every single day. But as the movement gained momentum, the resistance shifted from legal threats to severe acts of hostility. The struggle became a question of survival. Would the community break before the pressure did? The opposition didn't just use words. In early 1956, the homes of key leaders were struck by targeted and destructive acts of intimidation. Local institutions faced severe hostility, as the glow of fires against the night sky marked the gravity of their trial. The city struck back legally too, arresting over 80 leaders of the movement. Insurance for the carpool system was abruptly cancelled, and participants were harassed by local authorities at every intersection. Yet for every blow struck by the opposition, the rhythm of the marchers only grew steadier. They were no longer just walking to work. They were walking toward a new definition of citizenship. While the feet hit the pavement, the legal team took the fight to the highest halls of power, armed with the precedent of the 1954 Brown versus Board of Education decision. On June 5, 1956, a federal district court finally agreed, declaring racial segregation laws on public transit to be unconstitutional. The city of Montgomery appealed, clinging to the wreckage of a dying era, but the momentum was undeniable. On November 13, 1956, the United States Supreme Court upheld the ruling. Finally, on December 20, 1956, after 381 days of walking, the boycott ended. Rosa Parks boarded a bus again. This time, she didn't have to ask for a seat. She simply took one at the front, her eyes reflecting the dawn of a different America. The applause inside the Holt Street Baptist Church had barely faded before a cold, suffocating silence began to settle over the Parks household. Victory in the Supreme Court in late 1956 was a monumental triumph for the movement. But for Rosa, it was a double-edged sword that cut deep into her daily survival. The cameras eventually packed up, and the world's attention drifted to the next battlefield, leaving Rosa to face the grinding machinery of local retaliation. This was the silent aftershock of a revolution, a calculated campaign of financial isolation designed to exclude those who dared to lead. Rosa was abruptly fired from her job as a seamstress at the Montgomery Fair department store, and the blacklist was so absolute that no other business in town would dare hire the woman who had brought the city to its knees. Raymond, her husband, fared no better. He was forced to quit his job as a barber at Maxwell Air Force Base after his employer forbade any mention of the boycott or the legal case within the shop walls. The phone in their small home became an instrument of relentless intimidation, ringing at all hours of the night with menacing threats and the crackle of anonymous hate. By 1957, the air in Montgomery had become unbreathable, a toxic mix of fame and fear that eventually pushed the family to pack their lives into a few suitcases and join the Great Migration north to Detroit. They arrived in the Motor City seeking sanctuary, but they found a different kind of struggle. A landscape where the walls of segregation were not made of law, but of red lines on housing maps and the quiet exclusion of the northern job market. For years, Rosa lived in the grey space between being a national icon and a struggling citizen, often unable to find steady work while her face appeared in history books. It wasn't until 1965 that a semblance of stability returned, when she was hired as a secretary and receptionist for U.S. Representative John Conyers. In the hum of that Detroit congressional office, Rosa continued her quiet war, answering phones and handling the grievances of a community still battling housing discrimination and systemic misconduct. She didn't just rest on her laurels, she sought out the radicals, famously befriending Malcolm X and calling him her personal hero, proving that her brand of defiance was far more complex than the quiet seamstress myth suggested. A decade after Raymond's death in 1977, she co-founded the Rosa and Raymond Parks Institute for Self-Development in 1987, determined to pass the torch to a new generation through the Pathways to Freedom bus tours. But even as she entered her twilight years, the world continued to pull at her image. In 1998, an unexpected pattern interrupt occurred that would spark a multi-year legal battle. The hip-hop group Outkast released a hit song bearing her name. The chorus, which urged everyone to move to the back of the bus, felt like a jagged insult to the decades of trial she had endured. Rosa filed a lawsuit in 1999, alleging defamation and the unauthorized use of her identity, seeking over $5 billion in a move that stunned the music industry. The case dragged through the courts for 6 years, a bizarre collision of civil rights history and modern pop culture that finally reached a settlement in April of 2005. The rappers and the record labels admitted no wrongdoing, but agreed to work with her institute to develop educational programs, a final attempt to ensure her name remained tethered to its true meaning. By this time, however, the sharp mind that had outmaneuvered the Montgomery police was beginning to fray. Diagnosed with progressive dementia as early as 2002, Rosa began to retreat into the fog of memory. The woman who had once anchored a nation was now drifting, her life becoming a series of fragmented images. The smell of the bus's vinyl seats, the weight of her grandfather's unwavering vigilance, and the endless miles of Alabama pavement. She remained a symbol, but the human being inside that symbol was paying the ultimate price for her immortality, the open loop of her life. How to maintain one's soul while becoming a monument was reaching its final, quiet resolution as she spent her last days in her Detroit apartment, watching the world she had reshaped move on without her. On October 24, 2005, the world grew a little quieter as the woman who had once stood a nation on its feet finally found her final rest. In a modest apartment in Detroit at the age of 92, Rosa Parks completed a journey that had spanned nearly a century of radical change. The news rippled across the Atlantic and beyond, a global realization that the last living architect of the Montgomery miracle was gone. But her departure didn't mark an end. It marked a metamorphosis from a person into a permanent pillar of the American conscience. The morning that followed was unlike anything ever seen for a private citizen. Her legacy was carried into the United States Capitol Rotunda, where she broke one final invisible barrier. She became the first woman and only the second black person in history to lie in honor in the very heart of the American legislative branch. For 2 days, an estimated 50,000 people, from sitting presidents to parents holding their children by the hand, filed past to pay their respects. They weren't just acknowledging a former seamstress. They were honoring the woman who had redesigned the seating chart of the democratic world. In the cities she called home, Montgomery and Detroit, The municipal buses she had once challenged became rolling memorials. Drivers reserved the front seats with black ribbons, leaving them empty as a silent, haunting salute to the passenger who had changed the rules of the road forever. At her service, the air was thick with the weight of history. Then Secretary of State Condoleezza Rice stood before the mourners and spoke a truth that echoed through the halls of power. She confessed that without the courage of Mrs. Parks, she likely would not have been standing there as the nation's top diplomat. Rosa was laid to rest in Detroit's Woodlawn Cemetery, in a chapel that would soon bear her name, the Rosa Louise Parks Freedom Chapel. But the world wasn't done honoring the woman who had sat down to stand up. During her lifetime, she had been showered with the highest accolades. In September of 1996, President Bill Clinton presented her with the Presidential Medal of Freedom. 3 years later, in 1999, she received the Congressional Gold Medal. Time magazine even recognized her on its list of the 20 most influential people of the 20th century, placing her alongside the giants who shaped the modern age. The legacy reached its final, bronze-cast peak on what would have been her 100th birthday in February of 2013. The United States Postal Service released a commemorative forever stamp, and President Barack Obama unveiled a full-length statue of her in Statuary Hall within the United States Capitol. It was the first statue of a black person ever commissioned specifically for that hallowed space. Standing there in bronze, she looks exactly as she did on that December evening in 1955. Calm, composed, her coat buttoned against the cold, and her will absolutely immovable. Obama noted that in a single moment, with the simplest of gestures, she helped change America and the world. This is the ultimate closed loop of the Rosa Parks narrative. The girl who was born under the shadows of a hostile and exclusionary era, who walked miles while others rode in comfort, ended her journey as the permanent guest of honor in the halls where laws are born. Her legacy isn't found in the medals or the statues, though. It's found in the realization that a mind made up diminishes fear. She proved that you don't need a loud voice to be heard. You just need a soul that refuses to be pushed any further. The quiet strength she championed wasn't just about a bus seat. It was a blueprint for how a single individual can dismantle an empire of prejudice, one stationary, silent moment at a time. The history of progress is often painted as a series of accidental lightning strikes, but the legacy of Rosa Parks proves that true change is a slow, deliberate burn. For decades, popular mythology reduced her to a tired seamstress, a woman whose feet simply gave out after a long day at the department store. But Rosa spent the better part of her life dismantling that narrative with the same calculated precision she used in her needlework. She was not physically exhausted. She was weary of the spiritual erosion that comes from a lifetime of second-class citizenship. As she famously noted in her autobiography, the only tired she was tired of giving in. This distinction is the vital organ of her story, transforming her from a passive victim of circumstance into a strategic operative of justice. When she watched the bus pass her grandparents' farm in the early 1920s, she wasn't just seeing a vehicle, she was witnessing a mobile laboratory of segregation. By the time December 1st, 1955 arrived, she had spent over a decade as a lead investigator, documenting the very inequities she eventually decided to paralyze with her silence. She knew exactly what she was doing. She wasn't just taking a seat, she was taking a stand by remaining stationary. The physical landscape of America eventually caught up to the magnitude of her courage. In December of the year 2000, exactly 45 years after her arrest, the Rosa Parks Museum was consecrated on the very ground where the Cleveland Avenue bus had come to a halt in downtown Montgomery. It serves as a high-tech sanctuary of memory, capturing the electric, pressurized atmosphere of a city on the brink of a revolution. A year later, in 2001, the city of Grand Rapids, Michigan, dedicated the Rosa Parks Circle, a 3.5-acre park designed by the visionary architect Maya Lin. These spaces are not just tributes. They are anchors for a narrative that could easily drift into the realm of untouchable legend. They remind us that the movement didn't begin with a grand legislative decree or a massive army, but with a single woman in a buttoned-up coat, clutching a handbag, and a conviction that the law of the land was inferior to the law of human dignity. This quiet strength, the title of her 1995 book, was her greatest asset. She often remarked that when she made the decision to refuse James Blake's order, she felt the strength of her ancestors behind her, a spiritual wind that made the driver's hostility seem like a distant, insignificant noise. The ripple effect of that cold December evening provided the strategic blueprint for the next 20 years of American history. It paved the way for the student sit-ins in Greensboro, the freedom rides through the heart of the Deep South, and the massive march on Washington. Rosa Parks became the mother of the civil rights movement, not because she was the first person to resist, but because she was the one the world could no longer ignore. Her life remains a masterclass in the psychology of defiance. She proved that when one's mind is finally made up, fear evaporates. Knowing what must be done does away with the paralysis of what if. Dear, she didn't have the benefit of a crystal ball. She didn't know the boycott would last 381 days, or that it would propel a 26-year-old Martin Luther King Jr. into the global spotlight. She only knew that she had been pushed as far as she could be pushed without breaking. Her story is a manual for individual agency, a reminder that each person must live their life as a prototype of the freedom they wish to see in others. She wanted to be remembered as a person who wanted to be free so that others could be free as well. Her legacy isn't a dream or a dusty chapter in a textbook. It is a living document. It is the realization that the most powerful thing a human being can do in the face of an unjust system is to stop being a gear in its machine. By refusing to move to the back of the bus, she moved the entire world forward into a new era of possibility.